A discriminatory white manager has been covertly compensating a black mechanic less than his Caucasian colleagues. Despite the black man being among the top mechanics at the shop, the manager is taken aback when all the mechanics appear in his office. The air was filled with the clattering of metal and the constant drone of engines. At Greg's auto repair, Jamal Davis wiped the perspiration from his forehead and ducked under the hood of a dilapidated Chevy. His hands moved swiftly, loosening bolts, adjusting the engine belt, and securing connections. It was instinctive for him. At this point, the rhythm of repair felt familiar. He could hear Miguel's voice from the adjacent bay, off-key as he hummed a melody, accompanied by the sound of a ratchet being turned. "Hey, Jamal," Miguel called out, strolling over with his hands in his pockets and a smile on his face. He was short and stocky, dressed in his typical grease-stained coveralls and a cap worn backward. "Did you hear about Eric?" Jamal looked up, his brow furrowing. "What about him?" Miguel laughed. Leaning against the Chevy, he got himself another raise. Jamal wiped his hands on a rag and tossed it aside. "Another one? Didn't he just receive a bump last month?" Miguel shrugged. "I guess Greg appreciates his work." "Me? I'm still where I was last year. How about you?" Jamal hesitated before answering. He glanced at Eric, who was leaning against a workbench, chatting with Greg as if they were longtime friends. Eric had been at the shop about a year less than Jamal. He was a nice guy, but Jamal couldn't shake the knot in his stomach at the news. "I guess Greg has favorites," Jamal finally remarked, pulling himself back into focus. Yet, the thought continued to eat away at him. He was well aware that he logged more hours than Eric, exerted more effort, and resolved issues more swiftly. The Chevy in front of him was evidence of that. Greg had entrusted him with this job because none of the other guys could solve it. But another raise for Eric? Something didn't add up. "Don't let it get to you, man," Miguel said, giving Jamal a friendly pat on the back. "You think Greg's going to change his ways? He's been managing this place the same for years. You need to adapt." "I guess," Jamal grunted in reply. However, he wasn't fond of the notion of just adapting. He had been enduring it, watching individuals like Eric come in, receive raises, and advance while he remained stagnant. It was about more than just the money, it was about the respect, the acknowledgement for all the effort and hours he had dedicated. He leaned into the Chevy once more, tightening the bolts with clenched jaws. Shortly after, Greg sauntered by, giving Eric a pat on the shoulder, his voice loud enough for everyone to overhear. "Good work, Eric. I appreciate how you managed that transmission job last week. Keep it up and you might see another raise." Soon, Jamal's hands froze on the wrench. "Another one?" He felt Miguel's eyes on him, but he didn't look up. Instead, he finished the job, quickly packed up his tools, and made his way over to Miguel. As the lunch break bell rang, they grabbed their sandwiches and sat down at the old picnic table out back, surrounded by the smells of oil and gasoline. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling. "Something's not right," he said, finally breaking the silence. Miguel raised an eyebrow. "What about Eric about all of it?" Jamal took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly. "We've been here longer. We do more work. You've been fixing cars since before. Eric even knew how to change his oil. And I've been taking on special jobs, but raises aren't happening." Miguel expressed understanding but questioned their next steps. Greg has his own management style and ignores their concerns. Jamal felt uncertain and reflective. Someone broke the silence. Could he risk causing trouble? As lunch ended, Jamal's thoughts were consumed by the noise around him. Miguel appeared pessimistic, yet Jamal felt uneasy about the situation. The break bell rang and he disposed of his sandwich wrapper. He intended to investigate further. Jamal mentioned quietly to Miguel. Miguel looked confused, but Jamal focused on Greg's office door. He planned to inquire about the other workers' pay. Miguel was hesitant but agreed to be cautious. Jamal acknowledged the risk, emphasizing their right to know. Miguel encouraged him, albeit with a worried expression. Jamal remained silent as he returned to work the next week. He observed his coworkers closely for any discussions about pay. Something felt off, and he was determined to uncover the truth. One day, he approached Eric, a friendly but distant coworker. Jamal casually started a conversation while leaning on the truck. He congratulated Eric on a recent raise, to which Eric responded positively. "Yeah, for sure. I was curious, though. How long did it take before Greg started bumping you up? You've only been here. What, a couple of years?" Eric shrugged, tossing the rag aside. "Yeah, about that. I don't know Greg's fair you put in the work, he notices. I'm sure he'll come around to you soon enough, Jamal, just keep your head down. Stay focused. You know how it goes." Jamal forced a smile, though inside the answer only fueled his suspicion. "Yeah, for sure, thanks, man. Appreciate it." Eric went back to work, but Jamal stood there for a moment thinking. Keep your head down. Eric had said that was the problem. Jamal had been keeping his head down for years, working harder than anyone else in the shop, but he hadn't seen the kind of raises Eric was getting. He wasn't expecting handouts, but this didn't feel right, and if it wasn't just him, something had to be done. Later that afternoon, Jamal caught up with Miguel during a quiet moment in the garage. They were both leaning against a couple of cars, catching their breath. After a long morning of repairs, Jamal wiped the sweat from his forehead, glancing over at Miguel. "Talked to Eric earlier," Jamal said, keeping his voice low. Miguel raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, what did he say?" "Says Greg's fair that if you put in the work, you'll get the raises." Jamal's tone was flat. His frustration was evident. Miguel questioned if Greg would notice their efforts. He felt underpaid compared to Eric. Jamal agreed, stating they know their worth. He suggested checking others' salaries. Miguel was cautious, fearing repercussions. Jamal acknowledged the risk but stressed the need for awareness. Miguel lamented Greg's reluctance to change. Jamal decided he wouldn't remain silent about their unfair pay. Miguel supported him, prioritizing a smart approach. Jamal discreetly spoke with fellow mechanics about wages. Initially hesitant, the workers eventually shared their experiences. Jamal discovered a clear pay disparity based on race. The discrepancies were significant over time. One day, Jamal approached Carlos, a mechanic, while he worked on a car. "Got a minute?" Carlos wiped his hands and stepped back from the engine, nodding. "Yeah, what's up?" Jamal glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "I've been talking to some of the guys trying to figure out what everyone's making, just to see where we all stand." Carlos narrowed his eyes. "Why, you think something's off?" Jamal nodded. "Yeah. I do. I've been here a long time and I'm noticing that guys like you, me, Miguel, we're getting paid less than some of the new or white mechanics I've asked around, and it's not just a coincidence." Carlos's face hardened. "Man, I thought it was just me." I've been feeling like I'm being shifted, but I didn't want to stir up trouble. Jamal shook his head. It's not just you. We're all in the same boat. Carlos stared at the ground for a moment. Then nodded slowly, asking what to do next. Jamal was still figuring it out. But silence wasn't an option. Greg wouldn't change without pressure. Carlos sighed, doubting Greg would listen. Jamal believed he would have to if enough spoke up. Carlos remained unconvinced but agreed to help. Jamal walked back, feeling anger and determination rising. It was becoming clear this issue was about respect, not just pay. Greg had underestimated them, and that had to stop. By week's end, Jamal confirmed that minority workers were underpaid compared to white workers, highlighting a troubling pattern. He shared this with Miguel as they finished for the day, with the sun setting. Shadows stretched across the parking lot as others left. Jamal quietly stated it was worse than he imagined. They were being underpaid intentionally. Greg had been doing this for years. Miguel sighed, already suspecting this, and asked what to do now. Jamal, looking at the sunset, voiced their plan to confront Greg. They deserved better, Miguel agreed, though worried. Jamal stood firm, acknowledging Greg's stubbornness. He insisted they couldn't back down this time. As they left, Jamal felt a shift was coming. What began as unfairness had grown into a larger fight. He was now advocating for all mistreated workers. The break room at Greg's auto repair was basic, with mismatched chairs and a worn table. It was a quiet space for mechanics to relax, but today felt different. The air in the room felt heavier. Jamal sat at the table, his lunch untouched in front of him. Miguel was across from him, tapping his fingers on the edge of his soda can. They were waiting for the others. Jamal had already spoken to a few guys privately, but now it was time to bring them all together. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly noon. Any minute now the rest of the guys would be taking their lunch breaks and filing into the room. Soon Carlos walked in, followed by Terence and Luis. All of them looked a bit uneasy, like they knew something serious was about to go down, but weren't sure what to expect. They exchanged glances with each other before sitting down at the table. Jamal cleared his throat, leaning forward, "Thanks for coming, guys." Jamal started keeping his voice low. "I've been talking to a few of you over the past week, and I think it's time we had a real conversation about what's going on around here." The other mechanics exchanged wary glances, but no one spoke right away. Terence, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, shifted in his seat. He had been at Greg's shop for almost as long as Jamal. "What exactly are we talking about here, Jamal?" Jamal took a deep breath, looking each of them in the eye. "We're getting paid less. All of us feel undervalued. Many are working harder for less pay than newer employees." Carlos expressed his frustration, indicating something was wrong. I had been thinking the same but hesitated to acknowledge it. Luis, a young employee, pointed out his lack of raises compared to newer workers. Jamal confirmed this experience, initially thinking it was just him. After discussing, they realized Greg has been unfair for a long time. Miguel questioned their options, fearing confrontation with Greg. Jamal felt the situation was frustrating but knew they had to address it. Silence fell as they contemplated their inaction. If they remain silent, nothing will change. Terence suggested they approach Greg as a united front. Luis doubted this would be effective, given Greg's stubbornness. Jamal argued that unity would make it harder for Greg to dismiss them. Carlos agreed, noting their skills could compel Greg to listen. They sat in silence, pondering this solution. Miguel expressed skepticism about Greg's willingness to yield. Jamal shared Miguel's concerns but recognized their collective frustration. They refused to let fear hinder their stand. Greg would take advantage if they remained passive. Terence inquired about their next actions. Present the facts clearly. If Greg is uncooperative, they must make a decision, as they deserve better. Luis appeared anxious, worrying about being dismissed. Jamal suggested they deal with that if it happens, emphasizing their need to act after too long of inaction. Miguel nodded in agreement, indicating support. They had to unite and not back down. The other men confirmed their commitment. Terence urged action, supporting Jamal's lead. Jamal felt determined, realizing it was about everyone affected. Jamal initiated movement, stating they would confront Greg tomorrow. Miguel expressed concern with a grin, teasing Jamal about seeking conflict. Jamal clarified he sought fairness, not a fight, as they left the break room. As lunch ended, Jamal felt relieved, aware that their true test awaited, but he was prepared. Tension filled the air as Jamal arrived early at Greg's auto repair. Than usual. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly for a moment before he let out a breath and stepped out of his truck. Today wasn't just another day at the shop. Today they were going to confront Greg. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the sound of birds filled the quiet before the day's rush. Jamal walked into the shop, his boots echoing on the concrete floor, and headed straight to his workbench. His tools were neatly arranged, like always, but he wasn't thinking about the jobs lined up for the day. His mind was on the meeting they had planned. One by one, the others showed up. Miguel came in next, his usual easy grin replaced by a more serious expression. He walked over to Jamal without saying a word, nodding briefly before he started laying out his tools. Terence followed, his face hard and unreadable. Then Luis and Carlos, both looking tense but determined. They gathered near Jamal's bay, each of them glancing around to make sure Greg wasn't nearby. The shop wasn't officially open yet, so they had a few minutes to talk before Greg came in. "You all ready for this?" Jamal asked, his voice low but steady. Terence cracked his knuckles, as ready as I'll ever be. Luis shifted nervously, he glanced around the room. "What if this goes wrong?" Jamal reassured him, but they had come too far to back down. Miguel crossed his arms by the tool cabinet. They agreed to stick together with no turning back. "If anyone hesitates, Greg will notice," Jamal affirmed. They would approach as a united front, showing their seriousness. Carlos took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair. "What exactly will they say?" Jamal thought about this all night. He couldn't sleep, thinking of what Greg might respond with. One thing was certain, they needed to show they were serious about their demands. Jamal planned to speak mostly, but they needed to emphasize it was a collective issue. They would present their hard work and unfair pay. They would demand fair pay or they would leave. Luis was shocked, suggesting they might really quit. Jamal confirmed that if necessary, yes, but they'd give Greg a chance first. Terence added that if Greg dismisses them, they would walk out together. The weight of their decision hung heavily in the air. They knew the risks of quitting, losing jobs and income, potentially worsening their situation. But staying meant accepting less than they deserved. Miguel broke the silence, noting Greg's underestimation of them. Jamal agreed, saying they could surprise him. Just then, they heard Greg's truck arrive. They exchanged glances, nervous yet determined. This was the moment. Greg entered confidently, whistling to himself. His attire starkly contrasted the grease-stained coveralls of the mechanics. He didn't notice the group gathered by Jamal's bay until Jamal called out. To face the group. "What's up, Jamal?" "Something wrong with the car." Jamal took a step forward, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. "We need to talk, all of us." Greg's eyes flicked to the group, standing behind Jamal, his brow furrowing slightly. "Talk about what, Jamal? Didn't waste time about how we've been treated. We've been working here for years, putting in more hours than anyone, and we're still getting paid less than guys who've been here a lot less time. It's not right, Greg, and we deserve better." Greg's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. He crossed his arms, leaning against the door frame of his office. "You're saying I don't pay you guys enough? You're lucky to have jobs, especially in this market, and if you don't like what you're getting, there's the door." The bluntness of Greg's response hung in the air for a moment. Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for what we're worth. We've been here longer. We've done more work and we've earned more than what we're getting." Greg's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Listen. I don't have time for this. If you think you're worth more, go find another shop that'll pay you what you think you deserve. But I run things the way I run them, and if you don't like it, you know where the exit is." Jamal could feel the tension radiating from the guys behind him, but he didn't back down. "Is that really how you want to play this, Greg? Because we're not talking about one or two of us. We're talking about all of us. You lose us. This shop fails." Greg smirked, pushing off the frame. "You think I can't replace you? Mechanics are common, Jamal. You leave. I'll hire someone else. You're not irreplaceable." Jamal's anger rose, but he stayed calm. Maybe they could be replaced, but not like them. They kept the shop running, and Greg knew it. His expression remained unchanged. "Last chance. Jamal, stay on my terms or leave." Jamal looked at the others, heart racing. This was pivotal. He nodded and, one by one, they nodded back. "We're done." Jamal quietly told Greg, "Come on, guys." The group walked toward the exit, footsteps echoing in the quiet shop. Greg stayed silent as they left. Jamal sensed his disbelief. In the ensuing silence, stepping into the sun, Jamal breathed deeply. They had stood up for themselves, whatever happened next. The morning light was bright. As they exited Greg's auto repair, the sounds of the shop faded, replaced by their footsteps on the pavement. Jamal's heart raced and hands shook, but there was no turning back. They had acted, and the weight of their decision was palpable. The group stood in the parking lot, silent, processing what had occurred. Jamal glanced back at the shop, half expecting Greg to follow, but the door stayed shut. Nobody was stopping them. They were free. Terrence broke the silence, whistling and rubbing his head. "Damn, we really did that." Miguel sighed next to Jamal, shoulders drooping. "I can't believe that guy thinks mechanics are common." Jamal gritted his teeth, staring at the closed door. "He thinks he can replace us easily." Louis, still shaken, crossed his arms. "What if he does? What if he hires new people and we're left with nothing?" Jamal faced him, voice steady despite his emotions. "We're not nothing, Luis. In agreement, he's been getting away with this for years, but now he knows they're serious. Terrence's demeanor was tense. What's the next step? Are we just waiting for Greg? Jamal felt the group's uncertainty weighing on him. He feared this moment outside the shop they had all worked at, with no clear plan ahead, but turning back was not an option. They had made their stand and needed to move forward. Jamal expressed uncertainty about Greg's next move. But they shouldn't wait for him to act. Miguel was curious about Jamal's thoughts. As Jamal spoke, an idea began to form in his mind. They had the skills to fix cars better than anyone in town. If Greg won't pay them, perhaps they should work for themselves. Terrence frowned, realizing Jamal meant starting their own shop. Jamal affirmed his idea, highlighting their experience, talent, and drive. Luis expressed skepticism about the feasibility. Jamal countered that they could start small with just a space and some tools. Miguel considered the idea and then smiled, seeing potential. Carlos agreed, believing they could make it work. Terrence sighed but smiled, ready to go all in. Jamal felt a rush of determination he had. With his friends in the parking lot, he realized this was about more than just their paychecks. This was about taking control of their futures. "We'll figure it out, Jamal," said, his voice firm. "We've got each other and that's what matters." The group nodded in agreement, the tension from earlier easing just a bit as they started to talk through the details. They still had a long way to go and there were 100 questions they didn't have answers for yet, but for the first time in a long time they weren't just reacting to what was happening to them. They were taking action, and that made all the difference. A few hours later, the guys met up at a local diner. The chatter of customers and the smell of frying bacon filling the small space. They sat in a booth near the back, their voices low as they talked through their plans. "We need a space first," Terrence said, tapping his fingers on the table. "Doesn't need to be large." Miguel nodded while chewing his straw. He knows someone who rents storage units. A big one downtown could be affordable. Jamal leaned in. "That's a good start. What about the tools?" Carlos shrugged. "We have our own equipment. Most big items belong to Greg, but we can manage." Luis, still a bit unsure, spoke. "We need customers." Jamal smiled, recalling their loyal clients. "They trust us from years of work. Once they hear about our new shop, they'll come." Terrence chuckled, "And if not, we'll offer better prices and service. We can outdo Greg." Jamal felt excitement. They were truly embarking on this. As the sun set, they finished their meal and left. Jamal felt hopeful. They had taken a risk, but now they had a plan, and as they parted, he felt victorious. Climbing into his truck, Jamal contemplated the future. It wouldn't be easy, with challenges ahead. But for the first time, he felt in control. No more waiting for Greg, they were claiming what was theirs. Tomorrow, they would build something no one could take away. That night, Jamal struggled to sleep. Greg's dismissive image haunted him. He kept replaying Greg's words, feeling the sting of arrogance. The next morning, Jamal arrived at their chosen meeting spot. It was early, with the sun rising over the cracked pavement. The others were already there. "Everyone good?" Jamal asked. Miguel nodded, though his grin was missing. Terrence stood composed, lost in thought. "I've been reflecting on Greg's words. He's mistaken, we aren't replaceable. We've been essential to that shop for years. Without us, it would collapse." Fidgeting with his keys. "But what if he really does replace us? What if he brings in a whole new crew and we're just out? Jamal placed a firm hand on Luis's shoulder. He might try, but he's not going to find guys who can do what we do. We built that shop's reputation. People don't come to Greg's Auto Repair because of Greg. They come because of us. Carlos nodded in agreement. He'll see that soon enough. The plan they had come up with after leaving Greg's shop the day before was simple but bold. They weren't going to wait around for Greg to come crawling back to them. They were going to take matters into their own hands today. They'd begin looking for a space to open their own shop, a place where they could work on their terms with no one standing over them telling them they weren't worth their pay. All right, Jamal said, clapping his hands together to focus everyone. Let's get moving. We've got a lot to figure out. They piled into their cars heading toward the storage unit. Miguel had mentioned it was a few blocks away from Greg's shop, a large, run-down warehouse that looked like it hadn't seen action in years. But as they pulled up, Miguel grinned, pointing out the potential. "This is it," he said. "My guy said. It's been empty for a while, so it's dirt cheap. We can get it for next to nothing." Jamal stepped out of his truck, walking across the cracked concrete floor of the warehouse. It wasn't much to look at, but it had space. More importantly, it had potential. They could set up a couple of lifts, bring in their tools and start taking jobs right away. Terence inspected the space, noting the need for cleanup. Luis was starting to feel optimistic. They could definitely turn this into a shop. It's not perfect, but it belongs to them. Miguel was calculating their finances. Pooling their savings would allow them to offer competitive rates. People would come to them. Jamal took a moment to absorb everything. This was a real opportunity. They were moving towards something bigger. Jamal asserted their commitment. They would do it right and take pride in their work. Their skills belonged to them, not Greg. The others agreed with enthusiasm. Excitement replaced their uncertainty as they saw the possibility. The walkout symbolized building something better. As they began making calls, the burden of their decision eased. They were taking action on their own terms. That afternoon, they gathered at a cafe to plan. They spread out papers and outlined their business strategy. Miguel had supplier contacts for affordable tools. Terence had an electrician connection. Luis and Carlos started designing flyers for customers. Starting small was essential, Jamal noted. Once they got jobs, their reputation would grow. Miguel smiled, feeling optimistic. Greg would be surprised. The atmosphere in the cafe felt light compared to the previous day's tension. Jamal felt proud of their venture. This was about moving towards a better future. As they gathered their things, Terence slapped Jamal on the back. He appreciated Jamal's contribution. Jamal was pleased, but anxious about the future. He felt empowered for the first time. They were united in their efforts. Jamal modestly accepted the praise. They left the cafe, motivated to return to their families. As Jamal drove home, he contemplated the challenges ahead. Difficulties were expected, including potential retaliation from Greg. Nonetheless, they were committed to their path. The walkout symbolized reclaiming their skills and destiny. And their future. Arriving home, Jamal felt confident in their direction. Tomorrow marked the beginning of their new venture. The next morning, Jamal stood before the warehouse, keys in hand. It was old but represented new beginnings. The morning was fresh, with sunlight illuminating the area. Jamal inhaled deeply, preparing for the tasks ahead as Miguel arrived. "This is it, day one of our new lives," Miguel declared enthusiastically. Jamal responded affirmatively, checking Miguel's readiness. Terence, Luis, and Carlos arrived, appearing more at ease. They exchanged greetings with Jamal, gathering with a shared purpose. "Let's see what we've got," Jamal stated, unlocking the door. The door opened, revealing a dusty, musty warehouse interior. Hung in the sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows. It wasn't much to look at, but it was theirs. They stepped inside, taking it all in. The floor was concrete with oil stains from whatever had been stored there before, but it was solid. There was enough room for a couple of lifts, workbench, and a storage area for tools and spare parts. Terence, ever the practical one, spoke up. "First, we need to clean the place and get power to the back. Miguel is checking the walls for the lifts. It's not as bad as expected, cleanup will be easy. I can install the lifts by week's end." Luis offered to call his electrician cousin for help. Jamal paced, planning the layout. "Let's focus on the essentials, functionality over aesthetics." Carlos optimistically anticipated getting the lifts and tools in quickly. "We can start taking jobs right away." Jamal appreciated Carlos's enthusiasm, "but we need to advertise. We need flyers and a name to spread the word." Miguel asked about the name of the place. Jamal realized the importance of a name. It symbolizes a new beginning. "Let's keep it simple," he proposed. "Davis K. Auto Repair for familiarity." Terence agreed, focusing on the quality of work instead. Luis noted the name and planned to create flyers. They would distribute them widely to attract attention. Jamal felt proud. They were building this together. The empty warehouse was already alive in their minds. The first days were dedicated to cleaning and organizing. Miguel and Terence cleaned the floors while Carlos and Luis gathered tools. They worked long hours, driven by desire, each task moving them closer to independence. Miguel's friend delivered the lifts on time, and by Friday, they were securely installed. Jamal admired their progress as the space began to feel like a real shop. They had built with their own hands as the sun set that evening. Casting long shadows across the warehouse, Jamal gathered the guys around for a quick meeting. They all sat on overturned crates and toolbox, sweaty and exhausted but smiling. "Look at this place," Jamal said, gesturing around. "We did this in less than a week. We turned this empty space into something real." Terence leaned back on his crate, crossing his arms. "We're not done yet, though. We still got to bring in customers." Luis raised his hand, holding up a stack of freshly printed flyers already on it. "We're passing these out tomorrow morning. We're hitting the grocery store, the gas station, on 5th, and anywhere else we can think of." Jamal took one of the flyers from Luis, reading it over. It was simple: "Davis Kummer, Auto Repair, quality service, fair prices, your trusted mechanics." Underneath was their address and phone number. "This is good," Jamal said, handing the flyer back. "Real good." Miguel grinned, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "All we need now is that first car to roll." In the next morning, they split up to hand out the flyers. Jamal went to the nearest grocery store. Miguel hit the gas stations, and Carlos went to a nearby car wash. As they passed out the flyers, they could see people recognizing them. Jamal handed a flyer to an older man who nodded in recognition. "You worked on my daughter's car at Greg's, didn't you?" Jamal smiled. "Yeah, that was me. We've opened our own shop now. Come by." if you need anything. The man looked at the flyer, nodding. I'll keep that in mind. Good luck, son. By the time they regrouped at the shop in the afternoon, the flyers were nearly gone. They sat around the workbench, sipping cold water and reflecting on the day's work. People know us, Carlos said. Sounding relieved, we're not starting from scratch, folks already trust us. Jamal nodded, that's what's going, get us through this. Greg might have the building, but we've got the relationships. People know we do good work and they'll come to us. The next few days were quiet. They busied themselves with more setup, making sure everything was in place for when the customers started coming. Then one afternoon, the first car pulled up to the warehouse, a beat-up sedan sputtering as it came to a stop. Jamal's heart raced as he and the others stepped outside to greet the driver, an older woman. With a worried expression on her face, "Heard you all opened a new shop," she said, clutching the flyer. "Car's been giving me trouble for weeks. Thought I'd give you a try." Jamal smiled warmly, "You're in the right place, we'll take care of you." They pulled the car into the shop and got to work the hum of the engine. As they diagnosed the problem, the sound of tools hitting the floor, it all felt so familiar, yet completely different. They now had autonomy over their worth. Every hour they worked was theirs. As the day ended, they sent the woman off, her car running well. Jamal felt proud. This was their purpose. This was the future they dreamed of. They watched the woman's car fade from view. Terence smiled and spoke. "Just the beginning." Miguel encouraged Jamal. The journey was significant, but pride filled him. They controlled their destiny now. Jamal whispered to himself. They truly had this. The others agreed as the sun set. They realized they created something invaluable beyond a business. Weeks passed since the opening of Davis Core Auto Repair, and business boomed. News spread quickly about their quality work. More cars came in, leaving little time for breaks. Jamal worked on a transmission when his phone buzzed, checking a text. An old customer inquired if they were hiring. Jamal chuckled in disbelief and was about to call Miguel when he heard a voice. Greg stood at the door, looking diminished. He appeared thinner and less confident, struggling since they left. Jamal was aware of Greg's troubles, everyone was. Rumors said Greg's new mechanics couldn't meet the demands. Customers preferred Jamal's reliable team. Miguel noticed Greg too, pausing cautiously. The atmosphere grew tense. "Jamal," Greg called. His voice was strained. Jamal rose from under the car, wiping his hands slowly. Savoring the moment, he asked, "What can I do for you, Greg?" Greg's eyes scanned the shop, observing the bustling mechanics at work. Greg hesitated, taking a cautious step forward. He got straight to the point, mentioning the shop's struggles. His voice softened, almost pleading. He expressed the need for their return. Miguel smirked while leaning against a workbench. Luis and Carlos exchanged glances, trying to suppress laughter. Terence remained silent, his expression unreadable. Jamal took a deep breath, crossing his arms. He reminded Greg of his previous words about being replaceable and questioned the new hires. Greg's face slightly reddened as he responded that they didn't work out like his old crew. Jamal's brow furrowed, but he maintained a calm tone, recalling their agreement on leaving if unsatisfied with pay. Greg shifted awkwardly, admitting his mistake and underestimating their value. Jamal interjected firmly, noting that they weren't valued before and questioned why they should return now. Greg appeared desperate, claiming he would pay them more than before. Jamal considered Greg's words, recalling years of hard work and being overlooked. They had fought for respect, left when denied, and built something better. Now, Greg was asking for a second chance in their shop. Jamal looked at the others. Miguel raised an eyebrow, awaiting Jamal's decision. Terence remained still, offering no expression, while Luis and Carlos appeared ready to laugh. Jamal turned back to Greg, resolute in stating they were fine without him. Greg's expression fell, but he made one last plea, calling them family. Miguel laughed, unable to contain himself. Jamal stepped closer, calmly pointing out they weren't treated like family when they were paid poorly. Back. Terence finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the laughter. He's desperate, and that's what happens when you don't treat people right. Jamal watched the doorway where Greg had stood, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him had wanted this moment to see Greg humbled to have the last laugh, but now that it had happened, he didn't feel the need to gloat. They had won. That was enough. He turned back to the car he'd been working on, grabbing his tools. All right, let's get back to work. We've got cars to fix. The others laughed, the tension of the moment fading as they went back to their tasks. Jamal ducked under the hood of the car, but a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. They had built something better, something stronger than Greg ever could have given them, and now they were running the show. As the day wore on, more cars rolled into the shop and the sounds of work filled the air again. Jamal looked around, watching his crew. His friends move with confidence and purpose. They weren't just mechanics anymore. They were owners, builders of their own future. Greg's shop might survive, or it might not. But Jamal knew one thing for sure. Davis Camber Auto Repair wasn't going anywhere. They had earned every bit of success they were now enjoying, and they were going to keep building on it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the shop, Jamal stood outside, taking it all in. The warehouse, once empty and dusty, was now a bustling business filled with the hum of machines and the laughter of men who had taken control of their destiny. The last laugh wasn't a moment, it wasn't just about Greg's visit. It was everything they had done to get here, every step they had taken to break free from the chains of underappreciation. Jamal smiled, turning back to the shop they had built, something real, something lasting, and no one could take that from them. They had the last laugh, and it felt better than he could have ever